Now, we all know that Africa is the so-called last frontier, a new market to tap into, and that sparked some kind of interest in local African banks spreading their wings across the 53, 54 African countries. Is that really a trend, or is it just a very contained phenomenon we're seeing?
Loretta, I think it's a very interesting trend that's actually happening in terms of local players who have been market leaders within their own countries now adopting a sort of regional approach. And we're seeing that not only in West Africa, we're seeing that in East Africa as well. We're seeing particular interest from a lot of foreign banks who've had a particularly historical presence in Africa and wanting to expand their own footprint as such. So it's going to be really interesting times in Africa in these forthcoming years as such.
The regulatory environment, because each country obviously has its own laws and central banks have their own impression of what the banking sector should be doing. If you just look at the rumors abound around HSBC wanting to come into South Africa, how the South African Reserve Bank has been reticent. Is that the kind of environment they're operating in?
Well, I think, you know, you'll be able to see different reactions from different governments in different countries. What we're generally seeing in Africa is there's generally quite a bit of openness by regulators as well as governments in terms of enhancing their own banking system. I think a lot of countries have identified that there may be a few smaller players within their banking industry. There possibly may be a need for consolidation in those industries. There may be more core competencies that needs to be brought to bank unbanked population and bring more expertise into providing financing to, say, SMEs, into project financing, etc. So I think more than protectionism, we're seeing a lot more openness by governments and regulators in terms of welcoming banks and this regional expansion per se.
Let's look at the opportunities region for region. Southern Africa has been quite integrated just by way of South African financial institutions being able to access the market. But there's this one country that provides hot and fresh opportunities. That's Angola, an oil producer, many international players coming into that full post-war reconstruction. How hot is Angola and how dynamic is that space? Because we're told that many financial institutions are owned by the state. You have to partner with the state or compete against the state.
No, absolutely. Angola presents a significant opportunity. I just attended some conferences in Lisbon in the ADB, and I spoke to a number of Portuguese banks who do have an interest in Angola at the moment, and we're actually looking to expand. Some have told me that they'll expand another 100 branches in Angola. So I think there's a significant amount of opportunities, but let's not also forget Nigeria, which is going through its own bit of consolidation. FirstRand Bank itself was looking at an acquisition in Nigeria and continues to look at the country. But I think those particular countries, like Angola, like Nigeria, are going to be continually focused countries where there is potential for growth. But I think Africa and the integration of countries in Africa, whereby countries are starting to speak to each other, and in fact, these regional players are no longer scared of African risk. So we're seeing much more regional expansion and credit appetite developing within the African banking sector.
You mentioned Nigeria, and obviously there are a series of banking reforms, and many banks need to find partners to recapitalize. But what you do find in Nigeria, and indeed in West Africa, is that a lot of the financial institutions are indigenous banks, homegrown banks that have existed for the longest time in post-independence Africa. Is the environment open for foreign ownership?
Within Nigeria, I think the jury is out at this point in time. I think there are significant larger banks that have grown up, as you said, within their own countries and feel that they have now the ability to sort of progress and grow within the regional expansion. I think there are a number of foreign players that would possibly look at acquisitions, and particularly African banks. But I think let's not forget there are a number of key foreign banks also in West Africa who have been traditionally in the Francophone countries. A typical BNP Paribas would possibly also look at regional expansion into the rest of Africa per se.
Doing business in Francophone Africa, is it different to doing business in Anglophone Africa? There is that perception.
There is. And I think certainly the language barrier does exist. I think you cannot deny that fact. But I think Africa is also becoming regionalized. I don't think language is as a big challenge as what we've seen before. And I think with the integration, banks are starting to speak to each other and share risks.
We're running out of time. East Africa, it's an interesting area because there you've got almost even play between local banks and foreign banks, but you've got to be innovative. There's the technology issue. There's the fact that you've got to provide micro-lending to the agricultural sector. all those kinds of issues. How do you become relevant in East Africa?
Well, you're seeing a couple of things happen. One, there's been granularity in terms of the portfolio. Banks want to diversify their risk and they want to diversify their income. Secondly, you're seeing a lot of centralization of operations. A lot of capital has been spent in IT, in infrastructure investment, and banks want to make those particular assets sweat. They've also developed quite a bit of management expertise in their own countries, and they want to develop this management expertise on a regional basis. So what we're possibly going to be seeing is perhaps some more consolidation within the banking sector, a lot of regional players growing up and participating, which in a space that was dominated by mainly the foreign banks.